The morning it happened, the lobby of the Vertex Technologies building was cold and quiet, all glass and steel and filtered light. Charlotte Hayes walked through it the way she always did. Fast, focused, and completely certain of what mattered and what didn't. She noticed the man standing near the reception desk only because he was in her path. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a plain button-down shirt that had been ironed but not pressed quite right. A little girl stood beside him, her hand wrapped around two of his fingers. Charlotte gave them a single glance. Then she kept walking. She had a company to run. Have you ever dismissed someone at first glance only to realize, far too late, exactly who they were? The Vertex Technologies headquarters sat on the corner of a downtown block, like it owned the street, which, in a way, it did. 42 floors of glass and polished concrete, the building reflected the skyline back at itself with the quiet confidence of an institution that had never needed to prove anything to anyone. The lobby alone was a statement: white marble floors, motion sensor lighting, a security desk staffed by 3 people in matching gray. Every surface whispered the same message: this place has standards. Caleb Turner arrived at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before his scheduled interview. He had taken the subway because parking downtown cost more than his daughter's weekly grocery budget, and he had walked the last 4 blocks in the cold because the nearest bus stop let him off farther than he expected. By the time he pushed through the revolving door, his cheeks were flushed from the wind, and Mia was still holding his hand the way she always did in unfamiliar places, not scared, just watchful. She was 6 years old, and already better at reading rooms than most adults Caleb had ever worked with. "It smells new," Mia said quietly, looking up at the ceiling. "It smells like money," Caleb said, and then caught himself and added, "which means nothing. Don't let a building make you feel small." She nodded the way she nodded when she was filing something away for later. He checked in with the front desk, gave his name, and was handed a visitor badge that he clipped to his shirt pocket. The receptionist told him HR was on the 14th floor and that the elevators were to the left. She said it pleasantly but without making eye contact, the kind of practiced neutrality that high-end offices trained into people who might otherwise show warmth. Caleb thanked her, adjusted Mia's backpack straps, and walked them both toward the row of elevators. He noticed the glass walls, the open floor plan above, the way everything had been designed to be seen and to signal. He had worked in places like this before. He knew what they were. He also knew that most of the systems running behind those beautiful walls were older and more fragile than anyone in leadership wanted to admit. They waited near a cluster of chairs while the elevator filled and emptied again. That was when Charlotte Hayes walked through the lobby. She moved the way executives learned to move when they had been watched long enough, purposeful, clean-lined, like every step was already on record. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, her hair pulled back tightly, and she was speaking low into the phone pressed to her ear, already 5 conversations deep into a morning that had barely started. Her eyes swept the lobby the way a camera swept a room, automatic, detached, and looking for specific things. She noticed Caleb and Mia the way a person noticed furniture that had been moved slightly out of place. A man in a shirt that wasn't quite pressed. A child, near the interview waiting area. Her gaze moved on in less than 2 seconds. Behind her, 2 members of her staff passed Caleb with the same disinterest. One of them leaned toward the other and murmured something that ended in a quiet exhale of dismissal. Caleb didn't catch the words, but Mia looked up at him. "Are they talking about us?" she asked. "Probably," Caleb said. His voice was flat and unbothered. "It doesn't matter." He looked back at the elevator, checked the time on his phone, and waited. The interview room on the 14th floor was small, clean, and aggressively neutral. A rectangular table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard that had been wiped but still carried ghost marks of a previous meeting. A glass wall faced the open office beyond, where developers and analysts moved between desks and conference pods in the low hum of morning productivity. Jessica Park, Vertex's head of talent acquisition, was the one who conducted the interview. She was organized, professional, and had clearly read Caleb's resume, which meant she had read the titles and the dates without fully registering what was underneath them. She asked the standard questions first. Why the gap in employment? He had been home with his daughter after his wife passed. How did he manage full-time caregiving alongside professional commitments? He had managed it by being precise with his time. What was he looking for in a new role? A problem worth solving, he said. She smiled at that, in the way people smiled when they weren't sure if an answer was interesting or difficult. Then she moved to the technical questions, and Caleb answered them. Not at length. He wasn't the kind of engineer who demonstrated competence by filling the room. He answered directly, specifically, and with the kind of precision that only came from someone who had actually built the thing being discussed, not just studied it. When she asked about distributed system architecture, he described a specific failure pattern he had diagnosed 3 years earlier at a previous company, named the root cause, and explained how the fix had held for 18 months before the company switched vendors. Jessica nodded along. She wrote a few things on her notepad, but Caleb could tell, from the questions she chose to follow up on and the ones she let pass, that she was tracking the narrative of his answer rather than its technical content. She was listening for confidence, communication style, cultural fit, the softer criteria that good interviewers used when they weren't equipped to evaluate the harder ones. He didn't blame her. It wasn't her fault. But it was a problem. Upstairs, Charlotte was reviewing the candidate shortlist from her desk when she sent a message down to the HR floor. The message was brief and clear. They had 2 senior positions to fill, and the company's recent funding round meant they needed polished hires. People whose backgrounds would hold up to investor scrutiny, people whose professional histories told a story of continuous upward momentum. The candidates who fit that picture were already visible. The ones who didn't were a risk she didn't have time to manage. By the time Caleb finished answering Jessica's last technical question, the decision had already been drafted somewhere above him. Jessica thanked him for his time. She said they would follow up within 5 to 7 business days. She walked him to the elevator with the kind of warmth trained into the exit portion of interviews, genuine enough to feel real, brief enough not to imply anything. In the elevator, Mia looked up at her father and asked if it went well. Caleb considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "I told them the truth," he said. "Is that good?" "It depends on who's listening." The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. He took her hand again, and they walked back out through the revolving door into the cold morning air, past the glass walls and the gray staffers and the entire gleaming machinery of a building that had already moved on to its next appointment. It started small, the way most serious things do. 3 days after Caleb Turner's interview, a routine data sync between Vertex's customer management platform and its billing infrastructure ran 4 seconds late. 4 seconds. The kind of delay that triggered an automated log entry and nothing else. The engineer who reviewed the log the next morning flagged it as a minor latency spike, attributed it to network congestion, and closed the ticket before noon. 1 week later, the lag was 12 seconds. Still within the threshold, the internal monitoring system classified as non-critical. The on-call engineer noted it, ran a surface-level diagnostic, and found nothing unusual. He escalated it anyway, because he was careful, and because something about the pattern felt off. His supervisor reviewed the ticket and told him the system was under increased load from the new enterprise onboarding they had been running all month. Normal stress response. Monitor and wait. Charlotte received a summary report on system health at the end of each week. The reports were generated automatically and presented in color-coded dashboards: green for stable, yellow for watch, red for action required. The week of the first lag spike, the dashboard was almost entirely green. She approved the summary, sent a quick note to her CTO asking for an update on onboarding load, and moved on to the quarterly budget review, which was more pressing. She did not know, could not have known from the dashboard alone, that the 4-second delay had not been caused by network congestion. It had been caused by a fault in the foundational logic of the data routing layer. A structural problem buried in the system's architecture, not on its surface. Something that would not appear as a red alert until it was already too late to respond without damage. Caleb had seen it. He had seen it during his interview. In the one moment Jessica Park had pulled up Vertex's public technical documentation to show him the scope of the systems he would be working with. He had read 3 paragraphs of the architecture overview and recognized the pattern immediately. The same cascading dependency structure he had spent 2 years troubleshooting at a previous company. The kind of design that worked flawlessly under expected load, but fractured unpredictably. Under the specific combination of high concurrency and asynchronous writes. The kind of flaw that was nearly invisible until the moment it wasn't. He had almost said something during the interview. He had gotten halfway through, framing the observation in a way that wouldn't sound presumptuous, when Jessica moved to the next question, and the moment passed. He didn't go back to it. It wasn't his problem to solve. He hadn't been hired. He hadn't been asked. And, in his experience, walking into a company uninvited and telling leadership that their infrastructure was built on a fault line was not a gesture received as helpful. It was received as arrogance at best and a threat at worst. So he said nothing. Back home that evening, after Mia was asleep, he opened his laptop and ran a few calculations in a private file he kept for architectural reviews, a habit from years of working alone during the stretches, when Mia had needed him full-time, and he had kept his mind sharp by diagnosing systems he would never touch. He ran the numbers on what he remembered from the documentation. He estimated a timeline. He closed the file, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat with it in the dark of the kitchen. Inside Vertex, the timeline was already running. The data mismatch grew slowly, like a crack forming in something that still looked whole. Customer records began returning values that were 1 or 2 digits off from their actual balances, small enough to pass automated validation, large enough to cause confusion when clients compared records manually. Support tickets began arriving, politely worded at first. A few enterprise clients mentioned discrepancies in passing as minor annoyances. No one at Vertex connected the tickets to the architecture. They were still looking at the surface. Caleb was crossing the plaza outside the Vertex building when he heard his name. He turned. A woman was walking toward him, not hurrying, but with the kind of directed momentum that made it clear the movement was intentional. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a deep charcoal coat, carrying nothing except a slim phone. Her face was composed and quietly alert, the expression of someone who spent most of their time thinking several steps ahead of their current conversation. "Caleb Turner," she said again, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "Evelyn Carter." "I was in the building for a board advisory session." She stopped a comfortable distance from him and looked at him with a directness that was not aggressive but was absolute. "I saw your name on the interview list this morning. I recognized it." Caleb looked at her. He didn't say anything yet. "You worked on the Meridian infrastructure project 4 years ago," she said. "The distributed routing overhaul. The system that's still running without a single major incident." "That's right. I invested in Meridian before the overhaul. I watched what happened when you rebuilt that architecture." She paused. "I also watched what happened when you were asked to replicate the process at Hendrix Systems and refused because they wouldn't let you rebuild from the foundation." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "You did your homework. I always do." She glanced down at Mia, who was standing patiently beside her father, looking at Evelyn with the evaluating calm of a child who had learned not to rush her impressions. "Your daughter?" "Mia," he said. Evelyn smiled at Mia briefly, then brought her attention back to Caleb. "You saw something in there today, didn't you?" she said. It was asked quietly and without pressure, but it landed with the weight of someone who already knew the answer. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the building, then at the ground, then at Evelyn. The architecture documentation they showed me has a dependency fault in the core routing layer, he said. High concurrency write conflicts under asynchronous load conditions, the kind of thing that stays invisible for months and then causes a complete cascade failure. Evelyn nodded once. When? Based on their onboarding rate and the load patterns in the documentation. He calculated briefly. 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe less. If they accelerate the enterprise rollout. She studied him for a long moment. And you didn't tell them, she said. Not accusing, just noting. They didn't ask. Evelyn put her phone in her coat pocket and looked at the building again. She had the particular stillness of a person who was making a decision they had already been moving toward before this conversation began. I'd like to stay in contact, she said. He looked at her evenly. To be determined, she said. But I don't meet people like you very often, and I've learned not to let that pass without doing something about it. She handed him a card. Plain matte finish, her name, a phone number. Nothing else. He took it without looking at it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. I appreciate it, he said. Don't thank me yet. She glanced at Mia one more time. It was nice to meet you, Mia. Mia looked up with that serious, measuring expression. You talk like you already know what's going to happen, she said. Evelyn paused, then smiled. A real one. I usually do, she said. And she walked back toward the building. The system failed on a Tuesday. Not partially, not gradually the way it had been failing in the weeks before, in slow increments that were easy to mistake for noise. It failed completely, and it failed fast, the way structural failures do when the underlying fault finally meets the exact conditions it has been waiting for. At 6:47 in the morning, the Vertex customer management platform began returning null values on account lookups. By 7:15, the billing sync had stopped running entirely. By 8 o'clock, enterprise clients on the East Coast were reporting that their dashboards were showing either blank data or data that belonged to other accounts. A breach-level event that triggered immediate escalation calls to Vertex's customer success team. Charlotte was in her car when her phone began lighting up. She took the first call from her CTO, Marcus Hale, who told her in a controlled but strained voice that they had a critical system event and that the technical team was already in the office running diagnostics. She told him she would be there in 10 minutes. She ended the call and told her driver to move faster. By the time she walked through the lobby, the building felt different. The calibrated hum of productivity had been replaced by something tighter and quieter. The specific atmosphere of a smart group of people confronting a problem they didn't fully understand. Engineers were clustered at desks, with multiple screens open. A crisis room had been set up on the 3rd floor, and Charlotte went there directly. Marcus walked her through what they knew. The failure had originated in the data routing layer. It had cascaded through 4 dependent systems in under 30 minutes. The current state was a complete data lockout. No customer records accessible, no transactions processing, no billing functions running. Every enterprise client on the platform was affected. 3 of them had already sent legal notices. What's the fix? Charlotte said. Marcus didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. The team had spent 2 hours trying to identify the root cause and had not reached consensus. Several engineers believed the issue was a corrupted database index and were pursuing a restore from backup solution. Others believed the backup itself might be compromised. One of the senior developers had flagged a potential dependency conflict in the routing logic. But the analysis was incomplete, and no one had been able to replicate the exact failure condition in a controlled environment. Charlotte sat at the table in the crisis room and looked at the progression chart on the wall screen. She had built this company from a seed round and a 3-person team. She had made the decisions that brought them here, including the architecture choices, the vendor selections, the hiring calls. She looked at the chart with the same focused calm she always brought to hard situations and waited for clarity. The clarity did not come. By midday, the situation had not improved. A major telecommunications client had issued a formal breach notice and opened a line of communication with their legal team. Another enterprise client, a financial services firm, had suspended their contract pending a full technical review. Charlotte's inbox contained 47 unread messages from investors, clients, and board members. Her phone had stopped ringing, only because she had handed it to her assistant and told her to hold everything. The team worked through the afternoon. Partial progress. Partial rollbacks. One attempted fix that briefly brought part of the system online, before it collapsed again under the resumed load. By 5 in the evening, Marcus sat down across from Charlotte in the crisis room and told her, with the careful precision of a man delivering news he knew she didn't want to hear, that the current team did not have the specific expertise needed to diagnose and fix what was wrong at the architecture level. They could patch it, they could work around pieces of it, but to actually solve it, to address whatever was wrong at the foundation, they needed someone who understood the underlying design at a level that none of them had. Charlotte sat with that for a long moment. "Find someone," she said. The emergency investor and board meeting was called for the following morning. By 9 o'clock, the glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor had filled with the specific kind of tension that gathered in rooms where money was afraid. 6 people around the table, all of them careful, all of them watching Charlotte, whose face gave away nothing, and whose stillness in moments of pressure was one of the things that had made people believe in her early on. She was the last to arrive, which she did deliberately. Control of a room, she had learned, began before you opened your mouth. She walked in, set her tablet on the table, looked at the faces of the board members and the 2 lead investors, and said, "Good morning." She was preparing to take her seat at the head of the table when she stopped. There were 2 additional people in the room. One was Evelyn Carter. Charlotte knew Evelyn by reputation, a senior strategic advisor with a portfolio that spanned infrastructure technology, clean energy, and financial platforms, and a track record of identifying critical company failures before they became fatal. Evelyn was sitting with the effortless composure of someone who had been invited, not added. She had a glass of water and a closed folder, and the particular expression of a person who already knew how this meeting was going to go. Beside her was a man Charlotte recognized in the specific way you recognized someone you had decided not to remember. He was wearing a gray jacket over a dark shirt, clean and well-fitted, a different version of the same understated simplicity she had registered in the lobby days before. He was sitting with his hands resting on the table, and his eyes on her. Not with challenge, not with judgment, just with the quiet attention of someone paying close attention to everything in the room. Charlotte did not move for 1 full second. The sensation was not embarrassment. It was not guilt. It was the precise feeling of a framework collapsing, the rapid recalibration that happens when your data and your conclusion suddenly do not match. She had categorized this man. She had filed him. She had moved past him with the confidence of someone who trusted her own read of people. And now he was sitting in the most important meeting of her company's current crisis, placed there not by accident, but by deliberate choice. She sat down. Evelyn spoke first. She did not preamble. She introduced Caleb Turner as an independent systems architect with specific expertise in distributed infrastructure and routing layer design. She said she had been aware of his work for several years, and that she had asked him to attend that morning as a technical consultant. She did not explain how the connection had been made or what had led to this arrangement. She said only that she had invited him because she believed, based on what she knew of Vertex's infrastructure and what she knew of Caleb's work, that he was the most qualified person available to address what had happened to the platform. One of the board members asked how that was possible given the company had a full senior technical team on staff. Evelyn looked at the board member with the measured patience of someone who had answered this kind of question many times. Expertise in a domain, she said, is not the same as familiarity with it. Your team is talented. They are not familiar with this specific class of architectural failure. Caleb is. Charlotte looked at Caleb. He was looking back at her with no readable expression, not triumphant, not cold, not eager, just present. "Walk us through it," Charlotte said, and it was not a question. He opened the folder on the table in front of him and turned it so the diagram inside faced the room. He placed one hand flat beside it and began. What Caleb described was not what anyone in the room had expected. The assumption going into the crisis, the working theory that Charlotte's technical team had been operating under for more than 30 hours, was that the system failure was the result of a defective process, a corrupted batch job, a broken integration, something that had been built correctly and then gone wrong. The mental model of everyone in that room, including her most experienced engineers, was one of a functioning machine that had broken down. Caleb turned the diagram on the table and said, quietly, "It wasn't built correctly." He let that settle. Then he explained. The routing architecture at the core of Vertex's data infrastructure had been designed with a dependency structure that assumed strict sequential data rights under all conditions. Every layer of the system downstream from the router, the billing sync, the account management, the enterprise dashboard feeds, had been built to that assumption. Under normal load, the assumption held. Under the specific combination of high concurrent access from the new enterprise clients and the asynchronous write operations introduced in the last system update 3 months prior, the assumption failed. Not occasionally, not intermittently, structurally, every time. The 4-second delay you logged 3 weeks ago was the first expression of this failure, he said, looking at Marcus Hale. The escalating latency after that wasn't load stress. It was the system beginning to fragment along the fault line. What happened Tuesday morning was the fault line giving way. No one spoke. Charlotte was watching him with an expression that had gone very still. Not shut down alert. The specific alertness of someone who was hearing something true and registering exactly what it meant. "You're saying there's no patch?" Marcus said slowly. "There's no patch that holds," Caleb said. "You can restore the data from backup and bring the system back online. It will run. For a while, under current load, you'd have somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks before the same cascade recurs. Under your projected enterprise growth, significantly less." "And the alternative?" Charlotte said. "Rebuild the routing layer," he said. "Not repair it. Rebuild it from a corrected foundational logic. Then reintegrate the dependent systems, one layer at a time. It's not a fast fix, but it is the fix." One of the board members leaned forward. "How long? If the work is done correctly, and the team is coordinated properly, 2 to 3 weeks for the core rebuild, another week for full integration testing. You could have a stable system in 30 days. "You said correctly," Charlotte said. "I did. What does that mean?" He looked at her directly. "It means the rebuild has to be led by someone who understands the architecture they're replacing, not just the architecture they're building. You can't correct a foundational error if you don't fully understand why the original design failed. If your current team attempts the rebuild without that understanding, they will replicate the failure in a different form." The room absorbed this. Evelyn said nothing. She had said what she came to say. She sat with her water glass and her closed folder and let the room do its work. Charlotte looked at the diagram. Then she looked at Caleb again. She was doing something she rarely allowed herself to do in high-stakes moments. She was genuinely uncertain. Not about the technical assessment. She was not a systems architect, and she knew better than to question someone's expertise in their own field. She was uncertain about something harder to quantify. She was uncertain about the experience of trusting a man she had dismissed less than 48 hours ago, and about what it meant that she had dismissed him, and about whether the instinct that had caused her to do so was a habit she had always assumed was judgment. "You identified this before the failure," she said. "At the interview, it was not a question." Caleb said nothing. "You saw it in the documentation, and you didn't say anything," Charlotte said. Her voice was level, not accusing, tracing. "I wasn't asked," he said. There it was. 3 words, delivered without heat, without edge, without any of the satisfaction that would have been understandable and human. Just a fact, stated plainly, with the specific weight of someone who had spent a long time living inside the reality of being in possession of something useful that nobody thought to want. Charlotte held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the diagram again. "What do you need to start?" she said. What Caleb needed was access, clarity, and time in that order. And without noise. He asked for direct access to the full architecture documentation, the original system design specifications, and every changelog from the last 18 months. He asked for a small working group of no more than 4 engineers, selected for their documentation rigor rather than their seniority. He asked for a clear decision-maker on the business side who had the authority to approve changes without a committee review cycle, someone who could say yes or no within 4 hours of being asked. He put all of this in front of Charlotte in the 30 minutes after the board meeting ended, when the room had cleared, and it was just the 2 of them and a whiteboard. He was precise and he was brief. He did not explain his reasoning unprompted. When Charlotte asked a question, he answered it. When she didn't, he moved forward. What he proposed was not what Marcus Hale's team had been working toward, and Marcus knew it the moment Charlotte brought him into the conversation that afternoon. The existing plan, which involved a staged restore from backup, followed by a patch to the routing layer, followed by a load balancing adjustment, was, in Caleb's assessment, a delay rather than a solution. A sophisticated and well-intentioned delay, but a delay. Marcus had been with the company for 3 years. He had hired most of the technical team himself. He had defended his architecture decisions in front of the board twice and had been supported both times. Listening to Caleb lay out the case for why those decisions had produced a structural failure was not a comfortable experience, and he did not pretend otherwise. "You're asking us to discard 3 years of built infrastructure," Marcus said. "I'm asking you to replace one layer of it," Caleb said. "The layer that's causing the failure. The rest stays. That layer is foundational. You said so yourself." "Yes. Which is why patching it won't work." The tension between them was not personal. At least, Caleb did not let it become personal. He didn't dismiss Marcus's position. He didn't challenge his competence. He simply continued to explain, with the same steady precision he had used in the board meeting, why the proposed patch would fail and what the rebuilt architecture would look like instead. Charlotte sat at the side of the table and listened to both of them. She had opinions about what she was hearing, clear, sharp opinions that she was used to acting on immediately, but she held them back. Because she had spent the last hour reconsidering the speed at which she acted on her first read of situations, and she was not yet sure how much to trust that recalibration. 3 members of Marcus's team came in during the second hour of the discussion. 2 of them sided with Marcus. Initially, they knew the existing system. They knew where its limits were. They had confidence in the patch approach. The third, a junior architect named Ryan Cole, who had joined the company 8 months ago and who had the specific discomfort of someone who had already suspected what Caleb was now saying, went quiet for a long time, and then said that he thought Caleb was right. That shifted something. Not immediately. But Marcus saw it, and Charlotte saw it, and the room changed temperature. By 7 in the evening, the discussion had moved from whether to rebuild to how to rebuild. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing, the difference between a crisis that destroyed the company and a crisis that changed it. Charlotte made the call at 7:45. She told Marcus that Caleb would lead the architecture rebuild with Ryan Cole as his primary technical partner. She told Marcus that his team's knowledge of the existing system was essential and that their job in the next 30 days was to support the rebuild, not defend the design being replaced. She said this without apology and without softening. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He was a good engineer, and good engineers, when they were done defending their pride, recognized a correct solution. Charlotte looked at Caleb across the table. 30 days, she said. He said nothing. But he pulled out the pad of paper he had been taking notes on throughout the meeting, turned to a clean page, and began outlining the first phase. It was already starting. The 30 days were not clean. No serious work ever was. The first week was the hardest, not technically, but organizationally. Rebuilding the foundational routing layer while simultaneously keeping the restored system alive under live traffic was the equivalent of replacing the structural supports of a building while people were still working inside it. Every change carried risk. Every step forward required a fallback plan. The team ran on shortened sleep cycles and long silences, and the kind of focused, low-temperature urgency that came with knowing exactly what failure would cost. Caleb worked differently from what the team expected. He did not dominate the room. He did not assert himself loudly or correct people in front of others. He arrived early and stayed late, and spent the hours in between doing what good architects did, drawing on walls, questioning assumptions, listening to what the engineers said and what they didn't say. When Ryan Cole came to him on the third day with a concern about an integration sequence, Caleb sat with him for an hour and worked through it, without once suggesting that Ryan's concern was wrong to have. He treated the question as the most important question, which was how questions got answered well. Charlotte checked in twice a day. Not to micromanage, she understood this was not her domain, but because she needed to know what was happening, and because she had made a decision that involved significant risk and significant trust, and she had not yet fully arrived at the place where that trust was comfortable. On the 9th day, the first major test of the rebuilt routing layer ran clean. Not perfectly, there were adjustment points, edge cases that needed refinement, but the foundational logic held under simulated high concurrency load. No cascade, no null returns, no latency spikes beyond the expected margin. Ryan Cole sent Charlotte a message at 11 o'clock that night that read simply, "It's working." She sat at her desk for a moment after reading it. Then she put the phone face down and stared at the wall. The second week moved faster. With the foundational layer stable, the reintegration of the dependent systems proceeded with the careful speed of people who now had a reliable base to build from. The billing sync was brought online on day 14 and held through a full 24-hour load cycle. The account management layer followed on day 17. The enterprise dashboard feeds the most complex of the integrations took until day 22. On day 26, Charlotte stood in the war room and watched the system dashboard cycle through a full operational test. Green across every indicator. Load balanced. Data consistent. Every function that had been dark for the opening days of the crisis running cleanly, without latency, without error. The telecommunications client who had issued the breach notice withdrew it after a technical review. The financial services firm that had suspended their contract sent a message saying they would review reinstatement pending a 30-day observation period. Not forgiveness companies didn't work that way, but the beginning of a possible repair. Charlotte looked around the room. The engineers were quiet in the way people were quiet when a long tension released. Marcus Hale was reviewing the final integration logs with a focused expression that was part professional and part something she recognized as the specific relief of a person who had expected to lose and hadn't. Caleb was standing by the window, his back half turned to the room, looking out at the city below. He was not celebrating. He rarely expressed his work in terms of winning or losing. It was more that a problem had existed, and now it didn't, and the next step was to make sure the solution lasted. Charlotte looked at him for a longer moment than she meant to. She was thinking about the lobby. She was thinking about a wrinkled shirt and a little girl's hand and a 2-second glance that had cost her more than she was ready to calculate. That evening, after the team had dispersed and the war room had gone quiet, Charlotte sat alone in her office on the 40th floor and did something she almost never permitted herself. She sat without an agenda. The city was still outside the window, the skyline lit in the early dark of a Tuesday evening, indifferent and complete. She had a glass of water on her desk that she hadn't touched. She had 12 unread messages and 3 drafts for a client update and a board summary due by morning. She didn't open any of them. She thought about the morning Caleb had come in for his interview. She had walked through that lobby 1,000 times. She had noticed hundreds of people in the way you noticed things moving through your peripheral vision processing without storing. She had built the habit of rapid assessment early, had refined it over years of making fast decisions with incomplete information, and had come to trust it the way you trusted any tool that rarely failed you, except that it had failed her. Quietly, without announcement, in the course of a 2-second glance, at a man with a neat collar and a child's hand in his. She tried to reconstruct the thought. It wasn't a thought, really. It was more like a setting the kind of ambient judgment that ran below conscious consideration. A man who looked a certain way, waiting for a certain kind of appointment, in a place that carried certain expectations. Not bad, not cruel, just categorized, filed, moved past. She wondered how many times she had done that. Not just in lobbies, not just with candidates. How many conversations she had already concluded in her head before they were over. How many proposals she had dismissed in the first paragraph. How many people had stood in front of her and not been fully seen because the surface information had already settled into a conclusion. She had built a company on precision, on the accurate reading of data, the correct identification of value, the disciplined refusal to let sentiment cloud analysis. Those instincts had served her. They were real, but somewhere along the way, she had begun applying them to human beings the same way she applied them to spreadsheets, and people were not spreadsheets. People carried things that didn't appear in the first 10 seconds. Not in a resume. Not in the collar of a shirt. Caleb Turner had seen the fault in her system before her own engineers had. He had walked out of her building with the solution to a $30 million crisis in his head and said nothing because no one had thought to ask him. And the reason no one had thought to ask him was, at least in part, because of how he had looked standing next to a 6-year-old in a lobby where looking a certain way meant something. That was the part she stayed with. Not the shame of it. She had no patience for self-reproach that didn't convert into something useful, but the weight of it, the specific, quiet weight of understanding that your own blindness had a shape, and that the shape was yours, and that it had cost something real. She thought about what Marcus had said in the first hour of the rebuild discussion, when he had pushed back on Caleb's assessment with the authority of someone whose track record had earned him the right to push back. And she thought about the moment he had gone quiet, and the moment Ryan Cole had said the quiet thing that changed the room, and the way certainty had shifted, not because anyone had raised their voice, but because the truth had simply outweighed everything placed against it. She picked up her phone and found Caleb's number. She asked to meet him somewhere that wasn't the office. He suggested a small coffee place 2 blocks south of the Vertex building, the kind of spot with mismatched chairs and handwritten menu boards, and the specific warmth of a room that had never been designed to impress anyone. Charlotte arrived first and found a corner table. She was wearing a jacket she didn't usually wear to work meetings, darker and less structured, and she had left her tablet at the office. She had a notebook instead. A physical one. Caleb came in with Mia, which she hadn't expected. He had told her in the brief exchange that arranged the meeting that his sitter had a conflict that evening and that he hoped it wasn't a problem. She had said of course not. Mia came in ahead of her father, looked around the room the way she always did, taking inventory in that patient, precise way she had, and found the corner table before Caleb did. "You're Charlotte," Mia said, not impolitely. "I am," Charlotte said. Mia studied her for a moment, then climbed into the chair across from her and folded her hands on the table with the seriousness of a small person in a large meeting. Caleb sat beside his daughter, ordered 2 hot chocolates and a black coffee from the passing server, and looked at Charlotte with the same unhurried attention he had given her in the board meeting and the war room. She didn't open with business. She had planned to. But now that she was sitting here in a real chair, at a small table, with a child watching her with sharp, unclouded eyes, the professional frame felt wrong. "I want to apologize," she said. Caleb waited. "The morning you came in, I walked past you, and I made a judgment that I hadn't earned. She said it plainly, without hedging. The way she said hard things, when she had decided they needed to be said. I didn't see you, not because you were invisible, because I wasn't looking. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. It was not an absolution, and it was not a rebuke. It was just an acknowledgement. The kind that came from a person who had long since stopped needing the acknowledgement, but received it anyway without resistance. I'd like you to stay, Charlotte said. Not as a consultant, as part of the company. In whatever capacity makes sense for you, the terms are yours to name. I'm not asking because we need the rebuild completed. We do. But that's not the reason. Caleb looked at his coffee. He turned the cup once, slowly, in his hands. What is the reason? He said. Because I want to build something that doesn't break the way it broke, she said. Not just the system, the way we make decisions, the way we see people. She paused, and I'm not sure I know how to do that yet. But I think you do. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had weight in it, the specific weight of things being considered honestly. Mia, who had been eating a small cookie the server had brought without being asked, looked up at her father. Dad only stays where people see him, she said. She said it simply, the way children said true things without drama, without pressure, as a plain statement of how things worked. Charlotte looked at the little girl. She looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. He was watching his daughter with an expression so quiet and so certain that it told Charlotte everything she needed to know about the kind of person she was sitting across from and the kind of company she had almost failed to deserve. I see him, Charlotte said, and she meant it without performance. Caleb was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee. I'll stay, he said. Outside, the city kept moving indifferent and loud and continuous, the way cities always were, carrying the weight of all the stories playing out inside them. But in that small room with the mismatched chairs, something had settled, not because power had softened, but because someone had finally looked,